Is Donald Trump a dictator? I've been kind of wondering about that question for a while now, because recently I have read quite a lot of articles where people label him an autocrat or even dictator. And that's not particular to Donald Trump only, because we see the same phenomenon for Geert Wilders, Giorgia Meloni, Nayib Bukele or Viktor Orban. All of them are somewhat labeled as autocrats. But something seems off here, because I know a thing or two about dictators. I've lived under authoritarianism myself, and Vladimir Putin, let me tell you, is quite different from Donald Trump, because Vladimir Putin literally kills his opponents. And that's not true for Donald Trump. Don't get me wrong, I don't like the guy, but putting him into the same basket as Vladimir Putin, Alexander Lukashenko or Nicolas Maduro seems kind of wrong. So maybe political theory can help us here. For that, let's put those guys on a spectrum, because to be frank, they're there anyways. So at this end, we have the most radical form of authoritarianism, the totalitarians like the Soviet Union or North Korea. That's where it's not only about political control anymore, but here it's about controlling all aspects of social, cultural, and public life. That's where ideology and a regime transcends through everything that people are doing. And that's where mass surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and of course ideological education and no dissent from that come into play. So that's the most radical form of authoritarianism. And of course, there are many other forms of authoritarianism. There are military dictatorships, there are monarchies, and of course, there are single-party rules, like in China. So let's look at the most soft version of populism, and that's maybe where somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes into play. I mean, she says something populist from time to time, but it's rather vanilla, and we are not worried that she will implement the Soviet Union right away, no matter what some Twitter trolls are telling you. So these are kind of the both ends of the spectrum. Hardcore authoritarianism / totalitarianism or vanilla populism. So let's plug in our other figures here. Vladimir Putin, maybe closer to a totalitarian regime if you look at contemporary Russia. Donald Trump, no matter what you think about their politics, but probably closer to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So again, seems to be on the spectrum a little bit more moderate. And in fact, there seems to be something like a demarcation line, where we can distinguish between a populist and an authoritarian. So once you jump over that demarcation line, you become an authoritarian / dictator, and before that, you are just a mere populist. And if you want to learn more about populism, I can really recommend this video up here. But let's get back to our populists and our demarcation line that separates the autocrats from the pseudo-autocrats. Very similar to what Karl Popper did about science and pseudoscience. So, where would figures such as Geert Wilders, Giorgia Meloni, or interestingly, Viktor Orban fall? Are they already over the demarcation line? Should we call them a dictator, or should we put them into the populist category? So let's look at some features that really separate those two categories at the demarcation line. Feature number one is their source of legitimacy. For the populists, it's the will of the people, because after all, they win democratic elections. Whether these are always fair is up for discussion, but nevertheless, democratic elections are still in place. The same is not true for the guys over here. Just think about Vladimir Putin. Do we really think that he could lose a democratic election and then just retire? Probably not. The second feature is the use of violence and coercion. Under authoritarian rule, you have repression, suppression, and surveillance of dissidents. And while the populists are also dirty tactics against their political opponents, they don't retract to political force or violence. So again, as soon as you use violence, you're jumping over that demarcation line and you become a fully fledged dictator / authoritarian. The third feature is very closely linked because it is about political pluralism. In a populist environment, you still have parties or other movements organized against the populists in power or the populists running for power. So there is still vibrant democratic procedures in play. That's not the case for authoritarianism anymore. Here, political pluralism is either not there anymore, so absent, or it is a facade, like systematic opposition parties in Russia. That's more political theater than pluralism for voters to choose from. Feature number 4 is about your civil liberties. Over here, in the populist realm, you still have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. I mean, if Donald Trump says something outrageous, as he does, then people can speak up against it. They should do so. And they do so. And they go onto the streets to protest against him. We have seen that many times, and I'm happy about that. But that's not possible over here, under authoritarian rule. If you go out to protest under Vladimir Putin or Alexander Lukashenko or the stolen election in Venezuela, you will be beaten down. So there is no freedom of assembly or freedom of speech in those regimes. Unless, of course, you want to throw away your life or you want to spend the rest of your life in jail. The next features are about institutions more broadly, because they are about media control or the rule of law. In a populist dynamic, the institutions are still holding government accountable and build a counterforce. Likewise, there is independent media and a plurality of opinions to choose from. Again, that's not the case under fully fleshed authoritarianism. There is no space for independent journalism. Instead, the media, the narratives, and the truths are controlled by the regime. And likewise, they stack the courts with their loyalists, so there is no accountability or transparency anymore to hold their power in checks and balances. Similarly, there is a difference between the political economy over here and here. While you over here in a populist country might still have some free market elements and some business activity that is not controlled by the regime, you have a proper oligarchy or kleptocratic structure in the authoritarian category, most visibly in Russia, where everything is controlled under the hands of Vladimir Putin. And where that all leads to is that over here, under authoritarianism and dictatorship, there is no more political participation. There's rather cynicism about politics or complete apathy. And that's actually what all those rulers want. No more political discussion. Over here in populism, the picture looks rather different. There is still vibrant discussion. We are facing the populists. We are engaging with them. We are confronting them. And we can win against them at the ballot box. And that's why all of this distinction matters. What I just explained is not a philosophical thought experiment. This distinction matters because the way you fight a dictator is different from the way you fight a populist. A populist you can defeat at the ballot box. And that's actually what happened to Bolsonaro in Brazil. It happened to the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and it happened to Donald Trump before.
Winning is easy. Losing is never easy. Not for me, it's not.
And that's just not possible with the dictators anymore. And that's why this distinction matters. We shouldn't use the term autocrat too casually, because when we fight a populist, it's very different than we fight an autocrat, and vice versa. To be clear conceptually means that we know the tools, how to engage with them and how to fight them.